Okay. I'm sorry, just marking some attendance here. I think HQ will be sending out the link to the Zoom recording. I don't know exactly what the file looks like, or like the email, but I think Richard will probably just send out an email to everybody. Any? Okay, I think I've got everybody. Okay, well, anyways, let me get started here. So again, welcome to the New to Program workshop for the Master 5.0 series, specifically for the literature program. My name is John Im, and I am a teacher at Bundang branch, and I was sort of responsible for devising this program. I developed some of the specific modules or some of the specific units of the program, and then the overall structure kind of follows my sort of layout. So throughout this, I'm going to kind of walk you guys through how the program works. And if you've taught these classes before, any questions and stuff, I'd love to answer, and any concerns as well. So I guess, yeah, if there's any issues you have with the program as well, feel free to let me know, and I can see if we can address it in some way in the future. Okay. So for the Master 5.0 program, for those of you who were teaching Master's program, also here, my name, email, if you need to contact me. Okay, so for the Master's program, before the 5.0 program, so like in 4.0 and 3.0 before, we just had two main sort of tracks, the L series and the N series. So the N series was for nonfiction kind of topics, whether it was debate or like history or other kinds of topics. And then while the L programs are all literature focused programs. With the overhaul of the 5.0 program, there was more of a push to sort of have more on the nonfiction side, or more of like an integration with nonfiction and fiction stuff. But I was part of sort of the process of that. And one of the things I really wanted to do was make sure that we still had some form of just having a pure literature track available for these students, especially for students who much prefer reading fiction, or for teachers who prefer teaching fiction in general. So this program, I guess, goes under the 5th track, which is called Global Admissions, which the idea is basically these would be programs dedicated for students who are going to help students with admissions, whether for international schools or foreign language schools, or if they go abroad to other countries as well. And then so the literature classes here are going to be focused on basically the structure is going to try to simulate a literature class in like an American high school or whatever kind of high school sort of environment. Okay, so for the literature programs, these are the different tracks that we have. The numbers here denote the sort of the level of the classes. So these first two, the 100 level classes, are kind of our introduction to literature sort of classes. And then the 200 ones are for more advanced students. So if you've been teaching masters for a while, you'll know that there's students who are brand new, fresh to masters, versus students who maybe have been around for a long time, like 1 or even more than 1 year, at which point they probably exhausted a lot of the previous content at Cheongdam, so we have some higher level stuff for them to tackle. So these are the different tracks and sort of the themes that they are attached with. So coming of age literature, social conflict literature, spiritual, dystopian, wartime, Gothic literature, and then GL301 is a kind of a separate thing that I'll touch on a little bit. These are the book lists over here on the right, and I'll kind of go through each of these tracks a little bit more in detail as well. But basically, most of these tracks are based on the L series tracks that we had previously. a lot of these books existed in those courses as well. And what we tried to do was identify books that were popular with both the students as well as teachers, and try to just condense it to those as much as possible. That's what these two programs, the L101 and 102 programs are. These are basically from the L100, like the top books that were the most popular, that we tried to kind of condense into 2 tracks. And these programs, I think, are going to be the ones that if you are teaching this program or this track, you'll probably be teaching one of these 2 classes, because they are sort of I think a lot of branches use them as the introduction to masters. A lot of branches have like a pre-master sort of program or level for students who are technically at the level for masters, but maybe they're not quite ready, or they're just like below the cut line and they've been in Alpha Plus for too long to do Alpha Plus again. And so I think a lot of branches use these 2 programs as sort of an introduction into it. And that's sort of how the program was devised. These are a little bit more on the heavier side in terms of both the reading and the subject matter of the books. But these are like pretty good, just like introductory books that you would see in like any 8th grade English class in the States or other English-speaking countries. Okay, so for these programs, the programs all have specific segment guides that are available in the FTP and are on MERP under class-class material once you have the class actually in your MERP. And then just to give a quick look of the actual FTP stuff, see if you can all see that. Yeah. So under the Cheongdam 23 Summer Master Global Admissions, the GL series here, each of them have like the 100 series and the 200 series, they have relatively similar material because most of the like segment guides and stuff are the same between the different programs. So taking a look at GL 101, the material that you'll have the segment guide, which I'll kind of walk you guys through as well. The syllabus, some handouts for homework and the final project, as well as vocabulary lists for their vocab homework and their vocab quizzes. One of the things, if you haven't taught the master programs before, the 5.0 ones, the vocab quizzes are a bit different from the other levels at Cheongdam. So whereas the other vocab tests are review tests, so for example, in week 2, they would do vocab from lesson 1. These vocab words are instead preview tests. And what I mean by that is that the week 2 vocab test will use vocab words that come from their reading from lesson 2. So the idea is to sort of help the students as they're doing the vocab and doing the reading, that if there are words that they don't understand, that maybe it's something that from their vocab list could actually help. Besides that, we have syllabus, blah, blah, and that stuff. The other programs, they all have basically the same kind of content. There's just a little bit of differences in the segment guides for the 200 level ones. But besides that, the only thing that you really will need for your classes that are separate are going to be the syllabuses, as well as some of the homework, and then the vocab lists. Okay, so overall, the general structure of these classes is kind of similar to V1. The first sort of chunk of the class is doing like vocab tests, reviewing homework and assigned reading, then deep dive into the reading itself, and then as well as a literary skill lesson relevant to that week's lesson, that week's reading. And then the last part of the class, some sort of project, which could be like PPT kind of project or something a little bit more physical, or a writing project, and then a presentation of whatever their project is. The last weeks of the term, beginning in lesson 10, these are focused on the final project, which involves writing a big term paper and a presentation in the final week of the class. So I'll walk through that as well. Okay, so for GL 101, coming of age literature, we start with The Giver, Lord of the Flies, and then with Ender's Game. So we've broken them out to be, so weeks 1 through 4 is The Giver, then the middle of the term is Lord of the Flies, and Ender's Game last. So GL 101 and 102 follow a pretty similar structure in terms of the syllabus, like the weeks and everything kind of line up, and the type of books sort of match as well, where The Giver and for GL 102, it's The Outsiders, Gatsby, and The Book Thief. The first book is a kind of classic YA novel that in general, I don't think I've had any problems with students getting into either of these books. They're really fun books. They're really relatively easy to read, and they have a lot of things that the students can easily talk about and relate to in both of those books. Then the middle books are sort of the more challenging classic sort of novels, Lord of the Flies and The Great Gatsby, which you guys have all probably read at some point in an English class in middle school or high school, which are not always the most popular with the students, especially The Great Gatsby, unless you got like a particularly literary bunch. But they are great for actually teaching particular literary elements and devices, and going in a little bit deeper and challenging the students a little more. Then the last half of the term will have a bit of a longer book, Ender's Game, and then The Book Thief for the 102 program. These are just a bit more of the long form novels. The reading level, I would say, is the first book is easy, second book is hard, third book is a bit medium in between. And so for this, just having a bit of a longer form book to go in detail with. The 200 programs, these are mostly based on the previously existing programs, and they're just minor adjustments. The main adjustment was that most of these programs had 4 books, and we just cut that down to 3 books because the 4 books tended to be a little bit too much in terms of the actual reading expected of the students. Probably the number one biggest problem with teaching the literature classes is making sure the students read. And then what do you do when the students don't read? Because oftentimes you will run into that problem. So we've tried to adjust for that by sort of alleviating the amount of reading being done, but it is still an issue. So I'll try to talk about that a little bit later. But so this one, books focus on spirituality and the meaning of life. The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, Science State by Vonnegut, Life of Pi by Yann Martel. These books have, all of the ones in the 200 series tend to have a bit more mature themes. So ideally, the students you have will be a bit older, like middle schoolers, in which case it won't really be a problem. But if you do have younger students for some of these programs, then there might be some issues of talking about mature themes, which in general, I've found the best way to do is to just sort of dance around the topic without addressing it specifically. And if the students bring it up or want to talk about it specifically, try to talk about it in a very clinical manner so that it's not super provocative to the students. The second one here, this is probably the worst in terms of having mature themes. 1984, Brave New World, and To Android's Dream of Electric Sheep. So classic dystopian novels and sci-fi novels. There are a lot of very mature themes in these novels. So again, really should be for older students. But these are all really good books and classics, obviously. And the students often have a lot of fun going over these books. 203, Wartime. Actually, I guess this one also has a lot of really mature themes as well, since it's a bunch of war stuff. When My Name Was Kyoko, The Things They Carried, The Kite Runner, they all take place in countries that dealt with some sort of war-torn conflict. When My Name Was Kyoko is Korea during Japanese occupation. Things They Carried about the Vietnam War. The Kite Runner about wars in Afghanistan, specifically the Soviet-Afghan War. And so from different perspectives, the perspective of soldiers or civilians before, during, and after conflict. All really, really great books, but definitely, again, on the more mature side. So with older students, not really an issue, but with the younger students, it can get a bit graphic in terms of the language and the content. The last one here is Gothic literature, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Frankenstein, Dracula. So classics of Victorian Romantic era. I think Mary Shelley would be romantic, but classic Gothic novels. But because they're all 19th century works, the language is much more difficult. So for these, I would suggest to only really have for students that are advanced master students. Brand new master students tackling something like this, they'll just not understand what's going on with that. But for these books, because obviously and for almost every single book on these lists, there are all pretty well-read books in schools and stuff. So there's plenty of online material like SparkNotes, CliffNotes. YouTube has plenty of crash course videos on a lot of these that you can use as supplementary material to help these students understand things, or for yourself to understand them as you're trying to go through and teach them. Right, the last program here, GL 301. This is a program that's sort of designed to be a modular program for if you have students who have been around for a long time. So when we created this, the reason why I created this program was because I had students who had been here for 2 years, 3 years, and they basically saw all the different sort of books. And I also didn't want to like get stuck just using the books available in the official programs. So this program is sort of designed to facilitate, like the teacher can just choose whatever books they want to read, and the students will, well, hopefully you can dedicate it to the students and their schedules in a particular way. I think in general, most places don't use this. I think it's just me that uses this. But if you are going to be teaching this kind of thing, there is a list of books that are suggested with the like suggestions on how long you should read each book. Basically, like you'll want to give the students 50 to 100 pages of reading a week, depending on their level. But this should be for students who are pretty high level, capable of reading quite a lot. The actual smart textbook content here is geared towards or structured based on the AP Lit sort of program from like the United States high schools. So they're really, so the material is pretty high level, and I don't think it's a super relevant style. I don't think anybody's really going to actually teach this, but if you are, there is information about it in the second guide. Okay, so besides the actual smart textbook stuff, there is a little bit of extra material. So for the lit classes, it's vital that the students actually put in the effort to read the books. If they don't read the book, then it just makes the class completely, worthless. So what we try to do is have some homework that'll sort of push them into at least reading a little bit of the book at the very least. Your, like how lucky you are with the students reading can vary quite a bit. I found in general, if you have elementary students, you don't really need to worry about it, and they do a pretty good job of doing the reading. Maybe they don't always have the best comprehension of what they're reading, but the reading itself, they'll usually put in the work because they have a lot more time than middle schoolers. But once you get to middle schoolers, you'll have either, you might be lucky and have like really genuinely awesome and thoughtful, hardworking students. But in many cases, the middle schoolers will often be kids who've just sort of continued to attend Cheongdam for a long time. And so they've slowly like kind of had to be put into the master level at some point. In which case, for those students, if you have a class where like nobody's really doing the reading, I wouldn't super stress this homework that I'm going to talk about, but instead try to gear the class towards more explaining and understanding the story within the class itself, rather than having them relying on them to do the reading. Okay. But for the homework, so for the GL 100 program, there are handouts that I call quote notes. And basically, the homework is not very complicated. Basically, as they read, what we want them to do is to fill in this little worksheet with quotes from the reading with a page number, and that the student would like to highlight for some reason, and an explanation for why they're highlighting that quote. So reasons why students might highlight particular quotes is just something that they thought was interesting, something they thought was very confusing, or ideally, as you start to introduce different literary devices to the students, if they find an example of a literary device, like, oh, they found like a really cool metaphor, or like, oh, this is a great symbol of something, or they found some other kind of literary device that they want to talk about. And the worksheet comes with, I think, space for like 10 quotes, but you can adjust this if you would like to like a smaller amount or more, probably not more, because 10 is already quite a bit. And then for the GL 200 and 300 programs, there's a slightly more advanced version, which I call annotations homework. And for this, there's a sort of a guide of how to write out their actual, each annotation, I guess. And each annotation is essentially a sort of, will be a body paragraph in essay. So in this, they're going to include the evidence, the text that they found, and then whatever text that they found, we want them to make some sort of claim about the book, whether it's like the author's trying to say this, or this is something that we can characterize, or the author is characterizing this about a character. And so that would be the claim, sort of their main idea. The context would be an explanation of what is going on in the story at the time, the quote itself, and then the analysis of what is going on, explaining how that evidence supports their claim. And so there's a little guide here breaking down this that you can give to the students as well. And then also a section here for questions. And then for these questions, what we'd like the students to do is fill it out with discussion questions themselves, where as they're reading things that they think would be interesting to talk about with the other students in the class. I'm trying to fill that out. And then in the beginning of class, going over it with them. For this homework, this is homework that you should check at the beginning of the class, basically after you do the vocab quiz. And during the discussion of the book, try to keep the students' annotations and discussion questions in mind and try to incorporate that into the lesson. Okay, now let me swing over to the Teachers Portal. Okay, so in Teachers Portal, you can find the Smart Textbooks here, GL, blah, blah, all these guys. So all of the lessons are structured in pretty much the same way, except for lesson 1 of each of the programs will be a little bit different just because there's a little bit more introductory content. So let me pull up a syllabus as an example here. Okay, so in the first day of class, you should not expect the students to have come doing any of the reading. So the syllabus is structured to sort of facilitate for that. The reading is like pages 1 through 24, just the first 2 chapters. And the idea is you're going to actually read in class and have the students read that section in class. And whatever you don't get covered in that first day of class, just add that to their homework reading. The first lesson for all the programs will start with some basic introduction of the main themes of what the program or what that track entails. So for this one is about coming of age literature. And got like a blurb about stories and literary elements. And then I focus a bit on the coming of age genre, as well as some discussion questions. You can go through this content with the students. You don't necessarily need to like have the students actually read any of this stuff. This is more just to have like stuff on the page, I guess. It's more, if anything, for the instructor to sort of read and then digest that and then use that in your lesson as you're explaining things. Okay. So at the top, you can see there are 4 main categories here. So the Scout pages are kind of like the context pages for like C2, basically introducing whatever the main sort of themes that you're going to be discussing for that lesson. Dive pages will be the specific reading, close reading kind of pages. Explore pages will be a literary skill lesson, and then the project is the project. So Scout will have some sort of preview where you'll get an introduction of the book, get the students to sort of think about ideas regarding some of the themes of the book. And then in the dive pages, we'll have different little passages from the book for close reading with some discussion questions attached. There's, I think, like 4 to 6 dive pages in each of the lessons, somewhere around that. You don't need to go through every single one in detail. You don't need to answer every single one of these questions. There's space on their tablets for them to like type them in, but in general, what I would do is just like ask the questions out loud and not have them actually type in their answers in. These discussion questions and these passages were just sort of selected to ideally be like the highlights of the reading, but there's only so much that we can cover. So there might be some parts of the reading that you think is much more interesting that isn't covered in the dive pages. In that case, you'll just have to make a media card or a PowerPoint slide or something, or just use the book itself and guide the students. There's also some activities here in some of these pages as well. Not all of them will have an activity. But yeah, that's just the general structure of these pages. Okay, then the explore page will have some sort of literary advice. So this case, setting world building, introducing it, talking about it. Here, you'll want to throw in media cards that will help the students to visualize some of these ideas. And for some of these books, there are movies and stuff that you can use to either show clips from the movie or just like to have a visual version of the characters in the setting. Something I've also done recently is like I've been playing around with some of the AI art stuff for books that don't have any like visual material, and then just using the AI art and trying to put those pictures in, which has been pretty good. And then there'll usually be some sort of small activity related to the skill lesson. And then the project, project structure frame page introduces the project concept. ideate, give steps for basically planning out the project, brainstorming, and then materialize, making the project, presenting to the class. So similar structure as any of the V1 classes. And then the timetable. This is a general breakdown of the class structure and the time breakdown for the different segments. So beginning of the class, administrative stuff, vocab test, which starts in week 2. Scout, check any assigned homework that you did, introduce central questions. For the paper homework, this is where you want to cover that, making sure that they had the homework. If you want to go and use the homework annotations and questions in the class a little bit more specifically, you can apply it into sort of the dive sort of time. You don't need to marry yourself to these specific time breakdowns. It's just kind of a general guideline for that. And then lesson 13 is going to be just a presentation day. So it's just dedicated to final presentations. I'll go through what the final presentation is like as well. Okay. Then for the other lessons, so lesson 1 has like an introductory thing, but beginning with lesson 2, the only real difference is that the Scout page is sort of a review of what happened in the previous week's reading, which is some sort of question related to that. For here, you can, during like while this slide is up is where you should go check over their homework, things like that, field any questions that they might have had, and then we can get into the actual reading itself. Then, besides that, C-learning stuff, the students will also be doing iLearning for the class. There is vocab and writing components for the iLearning. The vocab is, like I said, is a preview of the next week's lesson. So it's not covering content from before, but it's only content. It's words that come from the reading that they're going to be doing while doing this vocab. The vocab also has some differences from previous lessons and previous levels in that it's all in English. There is no Korean translations for anything. So the vocab test that they do as well will also not have the English to Korean matching, but instead it'll be English to English synonym matching. So it's a bit more difficult in that. And they will also be doing, for their other questions, they'll have fill in the blank questions that are not where they just click and fill in the blank, but they actually have to type it out. So there'll be grammar changes as well. And all of the questions are pulled from their iLearning homework. So in general, I've had students who basically get perfect every week, and then students who completely bomb it. And it basically just comes down to if they did the iLearning homework or not. So if they keep doing poorly, just tell them to do their homework, and then they'll be able to do better on the actual test. Vocab lists are provided on the FTP. The students will not have a workbook printed out, or a workbook that they can purchase for these classes. So you'll need to print out the vocab list for them, but they can also access the vocab list in their iLearning as well. The iLearning also has the writing, and there's a speaking part to it, but basically they're just going to be presenting what their writing was. For these classes, all of the writing, I believe, are going to be critical application, so there's going to be a writing prompt, they write about it, they record it. You do not need to grade any of this stuff. This is all done by the iLearning team, just to show you what it looks like. There'll be a prompt. I choose to the Wigan children, compare, contrast them, explain, blah, blah, blah. Points they make, tips. They write, title, and then they present. You don't need to grade any of this. It's just checked by the iLearning team. You can check in like the social learning or the master's gallery for examples of students writing. And if you want to see your own students writing, you can go in the MERP under the management portfolio. You can open up to see their previous writing assignments. But in general, for the iLearning, this is not something we need to worry about too much. It's just something that you should try to make sure the kids are up, on top of doing it. I don't know exactly how every branch does it, but at least at our branch, it's mostly the staff that handles this side of things. So since we don't really have much power with the iLearning stuff. Okay. Now, the last thing for this class, each different master's class has some sort of final project. For the literature ones, we try to make it very academic in a sense. So basically, the students are going to be writing an essay based on one or more of the novels that they read. This essay should follow MLA formatting and include proper like textual evidence and citations. Depending on the level, the students will have different requirements for the word count of their writing. So it's 1,000 for 100 level, 1,500, then 2,000 as the levels increase. These can be adjusted at the instructor's discretion. The word level, the word counts are kind of high, but the reason why we have it so high is because basically the idea is if I set a word count limit to be 1,000, I expect many, well, not many, but some of the students who are a little bit more on the lazier side, let's say, or on the more efficient side with their time, might, I guess, more inefficient with their time, give me like 800 words, 800 word essay, at which point I'm pretty happy with that, relatively speaking. So by setting the standard pretty high, like even if they just don't quite meet that standard, like it's okay. Like at least they put in some more meaningful effort. Right. The essay itself will be due in week 12 to give the instructors the final week to grade and return the essays. There are guidelines, outlines, peer evaluation handouts, and grading rubrics on the FTP, which I'll walk you guys through quickly as well. And then the final presentation is something else, which I'll touch on in just a moment. But basically for the essay, there is a handout called the final project term paper overview, has some basic requirements, as well as a due date timeline, MLA formatting. Here you can find also like online, the MLA like style guide. I always use the online writing lab from Purdue University is what I kind of use as my go-to for staying on top of that stuff. And there's also an outline that you can print out for the students to fill out in class to work on. The breakdown of intro, body paragraphs, etc. How to incorporate that, the works cited page, all that good stuff. Right. And then there's a handout for peer review, just pretty basic stuff. You can do this in week 10, week 11, no, week 10, yeah, week 11 with the rough draft, and have the students give each other some peer feedback during that time. And then this is the rubric. Just has a bunch of different categories here, scale from 0 to 10. You don't have to use this rubric if you don't want to, but it's just a pretty like simple rubric that is pretty thorough in terms of giving sort of a meaningful grade to the students. Okay, so the class will also have in lessons 4, well, it depends on the class, but at the end of each book in the syllabus, so for example, for the 100 ones, because the schedule kind of follows the same structure, in lesson 4 and lesson 7 for the first 2 books. And then this should also hold true for the 200 books. So in this case, like for 1984, so lesson 5 and lesson 8, for those, there will be projects that are focused on literary or like analytical writing, essay writing, basically, that will introduce this sort of structure for the students so that when they get to the final project itself, they should know how to follow the actual structure. So I'll just quickly show you guys what that looks like. So here, lesson 4, the project. Yeah, so the explore page is all about literary analysis, talking about themes, using textual evidence, works cited page, and then structuring the actual body paragraphs. So here's an example. So main idea, evidence, analysis, linking it. And then their writing assignments, they'll choose one of the topics here and then write as much as they can in class. Probably on these lessons, you will not be able to have the students finish a full essay for this. So just whatever they are able or capable of finishing within the class, and then just give them some feedback on how to do it, on what they do well, what they did poorly, etc. So, and then lessons 10 through, well, the final project stuff, it'll kind of have a review of that, the rubric. And then for the actual topics, in lesson 10, there will be a list of different topics that the students can choose from for their essay. There should be 2 for each of the novels, and then 1 column that is like for multiple novels. And then they can choose any of these, but also if they don't like any of these, you can have them make up their own topic for their writing. Just make sure that you double check with them, or that they double check it with you and confirm it. So then by lesson 12, they should have a finished product for their essay. What I suggest while they're writing their essay is to have them write it in a Google document shared with you so you can sort of track their progress. You can just have them print out and hand or email it to you, but it's a little bit less reliable than a Google Doc. Okay, and then in lesson 12, they will be introduced to the final presentation. And the final presentation is basically going to have the students take a literary element or device that they learned about throughout the term that is relevant to 1 or more of the novels. And then they need to make a presentation about that literary element or device, but how it's used, not necessarily in the books that they read, but in another creative work of their own choosing. So another, like a movie or a TV program, video game, music that also uses the same literary element or device, and they'll be making a presentation based on that. So here on like the frame pages, there'll be details about what sort of the breakdown of what they need to include in their presentation. So literary element device for their choosing, explanation of the element device, how you see it used, yada, 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 yada. And then, so that will just be introduced in lesson 12, and basically the time dedicated to working on the project for lesson 12 will be dedicated to working on this, and their only homework coming into lesson 13 will be to finish making this presentation and then presenting it in the last day of class. In general, what I would suggest you do is tell the students that they need to present for a certain minimum set amount of time that will vary based on how big your class is. Because the idea is basically the whole day should be dedicated. Like the idea is these classes, especially the literature ones, they take a lot of work on the part of the instructor to prepare everything. So the last day should be you not really doing anything and the students do all the work. So if you have a class of, let's say 10 students, a presentation of 5 minutes plus 2-3 minutes of Q&A/feedback from the class for every student is a pretty good time frame. If you have a smaller class, maybe like a minimum of 10 minutes for the presentation, or like 15 minutes. I don't know. So I've had students present anywhere from like have very little and then just fast forward a presentation in like 2 minutes, and I'm forcing them to like keep talking for a bit longer, to students who have way too much to say and they'll be rambling on for like 30+ minutes, and then we need to rush through everyone else. So just try to be careful to like have the students have a lot of detail in their presentations, but also not to go too crazy. I guess, well, that's up to you how you want the students to do that. It's just annoying. And in lesson 13 in the Smart Textbook, there's like, it's very bare bones. It's literally just like some pages of review and then presentation, and the students should give feedback to each of the other presenters during this. So not just your feedback, but ideally like emphasize more peer feedback and try to get them to give some meaningful peer feedback, not just like the students will always do this like, oh, it was good. And then just try to move on. Try to get them to give specifics and details about why they think something is good. Make them actually take notes about the other people's presentations, not just play around. Okay, so that more or less covers all of the major points for the GL program. If you have any questions on more specific stuff, the segment guide is pretty thorough with going through each of the, like breaking down all the different components and stuff that you can take a look at. But a lot of it is also pretty straightforward. I think it's not super like, it's not like super complicated. If you've taught like V1, you can teach these classes for sure. But I will say what I do want to stress is that the Smart Textbook content, there's like a lot of writing on those pages and a lot of questions and stuff, but don't feel the need to go through every single page in detail, because that's just going to drag your class down. And what I would suggest more is, like, as you're reading, try to identify things that you think are really interesting to talk about, that you would be passionate to talk about, and sort of focus on those parts and sort of expand on that in more detail, rather than try to cover every single nook and cranny of the reading. Especially if you have classes where kids don't really do the reading, in which case you can just sort of have them focus on reading a certain part and really think about that more. Okay, so any questions about, well, basically anything related to the stuff? You guys can either just unmute yourselves and ask, or write in the chat if you prefer. All right, sounds good. Okay, so last thing, I just need you guys to do this little survey for me about the workshop. Please, in the chat, and just send it a link. If you guys can go ahead and make sure to do that. And then once you've done that, feel free to exit the meeting. And if you do have any questions, I'm going to stick around until everybody's gone. So if you want to ask later, you may do that as well. All right, but thanks, everybody.
Thank you.